thanks. Like you said, I'm Dennis Beatty. This is only my second time speaking at a conference, so I'm looking for all the feedback I can get. So I have my Twitter right there. If any of you are active on Twitter, I'd love to just have you just tweet at me. Any advice you have for future talks or anything that you can think of. Or if you just want to heckle me, that's fine too. Everything that I'm going to be talking about today, you can find in the Ecto documentation. I think that one of the main things that I love about Elixir is how great our documentation ecosystem is. Hexdocs is such a great tool and makes it so easy to publish amazing documentation. And so any questions that you have, it's all in there. And so really we have this amazing opportunity, and I highly encourage you to take advantage of it, to go and read over docs for any libraries that you might be using. It's kind of amazing sometimes how many features there can be that we have no idea even exist that make it a lot easier to do the things that we're trying to do that you can find just by reading through documentation. And that's basically how I have discovered pretty much everything that I'm going to be talking about today. But I need to start kind of with a couple caveats, address the elephant in the room, since nobody's ever made that joke. This isn't really a talk about Ecto, even though it's in the title. This is more a talk about Postgres and how to write slightly more performant queries to handle your data better. So in Ecto, we've kind of made Postgres a first-class citizen, and all the other database systems are kind of secondary. And so everything I'm talking about today is going to apply directly in Postgres, but might have a slightly different implementation depending on the adapter that you're using. So you'll probably have to just play around with it, look at the documentation for your adapter, and see if it's something that can be done. But one thing that I really love about Ecto is how explicit it is. Everything that you can do in a SQL query translates just so well into Ecto's query structures. Yeah, it's created this amazing, what's the word? It's basically created this paradigm where we are able to rely more on the database instead of on our code to do a lot of the really cool things that it can do. And so that's kind of what I'll be talking about today. So I work for a company called Podium up in Utah. And so I have to kind of give them a shout out. They sponsored my trip down here, as well as sent two of my teammates, Ryan and Jake, who are also here. And so I've been there for a year now, and they've been running Elixir in production for 2 years, just short of 2 years. And it has been an incredible experience for me. I had never heard of Elixir before I started at Podium. And so being there was like being thrown in the deep end of a pool. I was forced to learn Elixir very quickly, and I was able to pick it up pretty quickly as a result. There's a lot of really great developers there who have kind of mentored me and helped me to learn. But we also have two really good database administrators, Pat and Brian, who have done a great job of helping me to kind of learn how to build more performant queries, and have kind of helped to influence this as well. So a large part of what we do at Podium is focused on this. It's called the Google Map Pack. And this is Podium's core functionality is helping local businesses to improve their reviews by getting reviews from their actual customers instead of just the ones that are really mad at them. And so you might notice here, we actually have, my highlights might not show up very well. I mean, we have almost 400 reviews from our customers, and they seem to love us, and we've been able to kind of replicate those results for a lot of our customers as well. And so part of what I work on is helping to get those reviews and monitor them and watch how those scores are changing over time. And so I was reading on Medium about a week ago, and I saw this really cool article that was written by a guy named Daniel Silva about how he used Elixir to find a place to live in Portugal. And so kind of what he did is he was scraping a classified site and getting all the new incoming listings periodically, and then he would find the new ones out of that and send himself notifications that new listings had been posted. And I thought it was really interesting because this is actually pretty similar to what we do. We're constantly getting all the new reviews for our customers, and then we're having to reconcile which ones are actually new and which ones we've already seen, and then we're sending them notifications, we're helping them to respond to those reviews and interact with their customers in a better way. And so kind of what we'll be working with today, kind of as our example, is with Google's My Business API. And so this API allows us to get access to all of the reviews that have been left on a business in Google. Very self-explanatory, I guess. And so when we first started using this, we were actually really lucky because this was an invite-only API. So we have a really good relationship with Google. They're actually one of our investors. And so we got early access to this API. And I think it might be public now. You could check if you wanted to. But we'll be working specifically with this reviews endpoint. So again, I'm a big stickler for reading documentation. And so this API is pretty well documented. So you'll notice when we hit this reviews endpoint, we receive back a list of the reviews on the location, as well as the average rating, total review count, and pagination information. And then each review has several fields. So it has a review ID, it has the person who left the review, it has the star rating, the comments. And so kind of what we want to do is we want to grab all of that data, and we want to store it in our database so that then we can query across those reviews. We can reconcile the new ones against the old ones. And so the first thing that we want to do is set up kind of our Ecto Schema. And so I've created a schema, and this basically mirrors what we get from the API. So you'll notice we have kind of most of those same basic fields, but this has a bit of a problem. If we try to compile this, we get this error that the field ID has already been set on the schema. This is because the schema macro has already created an ID by default. It creates a sequential ID. And so what we want to do in our schema is create an ID when we want it to be a string, because that's what Google gives us. And this is surprisingly a little bit harder than you would think. And so in our schema, all we're doing is, oh man, these highlights are terrible. Should have changed my color. What we're doing is we're adding this ID field that's a string. And we're actually going to remove that. So what we'll do instead is put a primary key in there and specify that that's going to be a string. And so this will allow us to have a primary key that's not a serial key like we would expect, but we'll use that string that we want. And so then in our migration, we're going to be adding each of those columns, but automatically we'll be adding in that sequential ID. And so we have to tell it specifically that we want to be using this primary key. So we have to specify that we don't want it to create a primary key automatically. And then we have to specify which field we want to use as the primary key instead. And so once we do this, ta-da, we're getting this set up properly so that we can use that string key. Now, this isn't super difficult with a string. It's not super easy, but it's not super difficult. But once we get into many-to-many relationships, it makes things slightly different. How many of you have worked with databases much in the past and set up your own databases? Basically all of us. So hopefully this isn't something new to most of you. But anytime that you want to have a many-to-many relationship, you're going to use what's called a join table. So This is an app that I started to write called Sir Alex. It's meant to do group management so that you can send messages to a group, similar to kind of what Meetup does. And so you have your user schema, and then you have your group schema, and those are two separate tables in our database. But in order to show which members or which users are members of which group and which users belong to a group, we want to have a membership. And so the way that we're going to do that is by creating a member join table. And so that join table needs to specify a user, it needs to specify a group, and it needs to specify a role, similar to what you'll see here. And so by doing that, we're able to create that many-to-many relationship. But we want, typically with a join table, you want to set up a primary key across multiple columns, what's called a composite key. And so in this case, we'll be having our composite key across the user ID and the group ID columns. So in order to do this, we're going to, in our schema, instead of specifying this time that we want a string ID, we actually want to set our primary key to false. This is because we have the two belongs to statements below, setting up that association between the user and the group with the member. So then we're going to, in our migration, we're going to create that table, and again, we're going to specify that we don't want to set a primary key automatically on the table, but instead we want to add the primary key on the group ID column, but also on the user ID column. And by setting it on both of those, it will automatically kind of create that composite key for us. Then the final thing that we want to do is in our schema for the group and for the user, we want to actually set up that many-to-many relationship. So this is our user schema. We want to add that many-to-many relationship with groups, but we want to specify that we're joining through the member table. And this allows Ecto to know that we have that join table set up. And so we can specifically call user.groups and get back a list of groups, even though it's having to join through that member table. It handles that automatically. And so then we get another ta-da. Y'all don't seem very excited about my ta-das. So, okay, back to reviews. So we already have a schema set up. We have a migration set up. And so we have everything that we need to start storing those reviews. So now we just need to actually do it. So when we're calling the API, this is what we're getting back. We're getting back a list of reviews. And so we need to actually handle saving more than one review because we're not getting back a single review in that structure. So in our, depending on what you want to call this, our reviews module, potentially a context, we want to have our save reviews function that will actually save each review. So what this does is this will map over all of our reviews, run the save review function, so it'll send it through the change set, make sure it's valid, and then it'll insert it. Now, this will generate SQL that looks something like this. So it'll insert into the reviews table, and then it'll have the values that'll be inserted. So this is a bit of a problem because of the way that SQL works. When we tell Ecto to insert a record into the table, the first thing we have to do is check out a database connection from the pool. Then we send that review data to the database, which saves it, and then we wait for that response to come back, and then we can release the connection back into the pool. Now this is great, but then we have to do it again for the next review, and again for the next. And so we have to keep checking out a connection, putting the data in, and then releasing that connection. And we're doing this over and over. And so this really is not the most efficient way to handle this. So what we can do in SQL is we can provide a list of values to be inserted. So we can specify more reviews, and in a single query, we can insert all of those. And so in order to do this in Ecto, we're going to have to get rid of most of this, and instead we can replace it with just a simple insert all function. This accepts, it doesn't accept change sets. It only accepts maps. And so we are inserting a bunch of maps, but you might notice there's one problem here, and that is that there's no validation. Without the change sets, we're not validating whether or not the data that we're inserting into the database is good. And so I'm not actually going to get into that today, but what I would recommend looking into is creating change sets and checking that they're valid, but then just returning the original map to be inserted into the database. And that will allow you to validate even before you use an insert all. So get another ta-da. Oh, thank you. So we have a problem though, because when we crawl these reviews, we're not crawling them one single time. We're actually crawling these periodically so that we can check for new reviews. And so what's happening is we're getting a list of 2 reviews, and then the next day we might get a list of 3 reviews, 2 of the original and 1 new one, and the next day we'll get 4. And so we're constantly adding new reviews, but we're also receiving those same ones over and over. And so when we try inserting them into the database, we're going to run into a Postgres error because of the unique constraint on the primary key. So there's a couple different ways that we can handle this. Ecto provides a unique constraint function that we can put on the change set. And what this will do is it will allow us to return the error instead of throwing an error. And it will, it'll make it so that we can actually handle that. But we might not want an error. We might want, this might not be an error to us. It might just be that we're trying to insert and we don't want to actually insert if it's already there. So another option is the unsafe validate unique function. So this validates that no other record already exists in the database, but you might notice that it has the word unsafe in the title, which might be a bit of a red flag. This is because it creates a race condition. When we try to check if a record already exists in the database before we insert, there's a chance that in between our check and the insert, that record will have already been inserted. And so when we do this, then there's still a chance that we'll run into that same constraint. And so that's another thing I love about Ecto, actually, is the fact that they put unsafe on that function to make it very clear that that's not something to be relied on. And so instead what we're going to do is use an upsert. So in Postgres 9.5, we added it's called the insert on conflict clause, and that allows you to attempt an insert, and if there is any conflict with unique constraints, you can do an update instead. And then that was supported in Ecto 2.1. And so basically, you'll notice here we're adding this special opts list that has the on conflict set to nothing, and passing that in when we do our insert all. And so that handles the SQL to actually do that. So again, another ta-da. But what if we don't want to swallow that? What if we actually do want to update? There's a chance that our reviews, as they've been sitting in Google, that somebody has gone in and edited their review. They could have changed it from saying, you know, I had a great time here, to saying, you know, I had a great time, but now that it's been 3 days, I realize this place is not cool at all. And so we want to find that out. We don't want to be telling the customer that, yeah, everything's great, when it's really not. And so what we can do is use onConflict replace all. So what that will do is anytime the unique constraint is hit, it will actually replace all the fields in that row with all the fields that we're providing. The problem is, if we do this as is, we're going to get another Postgres error saying that we require specification of a constraint to target. And so when you want to use an update in your onConflict, you have to actually specify a conflict target. So in Ecto, that's pretty simple. You just have this conflict target option that you pass in, specifying on which fields there would be that unique constraint to watch for. So then we get another ta-da. But the problem is, what if we don't want to update everything? What if we just want to update one or two of the fields? And so let's say we only want to update the review body that we're saving into the comment field. So we can do that by setting the comment on conflict. Now, the problem with this is now we're hard-coded. So at this point, we're not actually gaining any benefit from using that insert all again. All of our reviews that we bring in will now be set to say updated if they already exist in the database. Now, at this point, I was a little bit frustrated when I first found this. It was about 6 months ago, and I was super excited because I don't know if you guys have those things in programming that like you just get like really excited when you figure something out. You really want to be able to use it. And so I was really excited about this upsert that I had just figured out about. And then I found out that I couldn't actually use the fields that were specified. And it was just like hitting a wall. I was kind of mad, actually. And so I did not give up, and I kept searching. And I was reading through the documentation for Postgres, and I specifically found this, again, the highlight's kind of hard to see, found this little bit here about how, I'll just read it. It says, the set and where clauses in onConflict do update have access to the existing row using the table's name and to rows proposed for insertion using the special excluded table. So I heard about this excluded table, and I got really excited again. And I found down below this perfect example of how to use it. So you'll see they do this insert into, and then they provide the list of values, and then they provide the onConflict clause. But then after that, they say do update set dname equals excluded.dname. And I was excited. I was like, okay, this is exactly what I want. And then I had to figure out, okay, how do I do this in Ecto? And up to that point, pretty much everything that I wanted to be able to do in SQL had an equivalent in Ecto. There was already a function written that would allow you to do this. And so I searched for that for a couple days, actually. I read through the Ecto docs several times just looking for like the option to actually do this, and couldn't find it anywhere. And finally, I found a comment on a GitHub issue that Jose wrote. And he basically said, yeah, we don't have that, but you can do it using fragments. And so I had never had a reason to use a fragment before. So again, this got me really excited. And he actually specified pretty much exactly how to do that. So just using that code in our function, we can add a fragment. So we're creating a query saying to update the comment to a fragment, calling this excluded table, and calling the comment column there. And so this basically allows us to, if we detect a conflict on the ID, then we set the review body of the current review to be the comment here. And once again, another ta-da. And this one was extremely exciting for me. But as I used this, I came across one big caveat. Postgres has kind of an issue with their onConflict. And this is something that probably wouldn't affect a lot of people unless you're using sequential IDs. And so I found this in the Postgres mailing list. Somebody reported a bug, and they said, hey, I'm trying to use an insert on conflict, and whenever I update this, I'm noticing that my primary key sequence is still incrementing. And so honestly, I gave a link to this mailing list thread. I highly recommend reading it because it's actually really funny. It's a bunch of people complaining about this bug, and then a bunch of other people saying, oh, that's not a bug, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. and then others trying to convince them otherwise. And so basically, this is because of the way that the onConflict is implemented under the hood. So basically what happens whenever you try to insert a record, if you have a sequential ID, the first thing that happens is you're going to grab the next value from that sequence. Now, I have an asterisk next to this, and that's because it's not a pure get. We actually have side effects on this. So when you get the next value from the sequence, it's also incrementing that sequence and telling it, okay, I got this sequential ID, so go ahead and get ready, and the next person that comes through, give them the next one. So we get that ID from the sequence, then we're inserting the row. Now, if we run into a unique constraint error, we hit that onConflict clause, and chances are we might not be updating the ID to the next one in the sequence, and so we end up with these huge gaps. And the gaps in the sequence aren't a big deal. That's something that any database should be prepared for. The main problem is when you're running through high amounts of data, that sequence incrementing can be an issue. And so you might need to consider using a bigger integer field, or you might consider using a different type of primary key, particularly like a UUID or something that won't have a sequence to be incremented, because you could end up running into some issues with the amount of data. And so, unfortunately, I don't really have an answer to how to fix this other than that, but it is definitely something that you'll want to be aware of as you're working with this. So, going back, now we have this list of reviews. And so this is kind of what we're getting back from the Google API. I've restructured it a little bit so that it fits our schemas perfectly. And then what we're going to do is we're going to run that function that we set up, reviews.saveReviews, and pass in that list of reviews. And so what we get back is a tuple containing the number of rows that were affected and anything that we're returning, which in this case is nil. Now, this is typically all that we need, but I'm not going to go into this too much, but if we wanted to, for instance, save associations on those records, that's one of the places where insert all makes things a little bit more difficult. So what we would like to have is the ID from each of those records that we've inserted, so that then any of the records that would be underneath those that would need that association stored can use that ID in their records. And so one way that we can do this is using the returning statement. So you'll notice here we have a third option, which is returning true. Now, we can actually use returning on several different things. We could say, I want to return the ID. We could say, I want to return true returns the entire record. And so what we're doing is when we call save reviews, then we get back instead the number of rows that were affected as well as a list of structs that were inserted into the database so that we can then use those to do any further processing with. Now, again, if in this particular case with the reviews where we're using these string keys that we got from Google, it's not a huge deal because we already have those IDs around. But if you're not using those, this can actually be really helpful for making it so that instead of having to insert associations after you've inserted each record, we can insert them in several big queries instead and get a lot of performance benefits there. So those are kind of the main things that I wanted to talk about today. That's kind of the extent of what I have prepared. I do want to say, though, again, thanks to Podium for paying for me to come here. And so I'm also throwing up their jobs link. We get to work with Elixir. It's 90% of what we're doing. And so if any of you are interested, you're welcome to apply. But in terms of further reading, further education, I would highly recommend, these are all really good sources, especially that last one. But Plataformatech released a PDF that has a lot of really cool features of Ecto and kind of goes through how to use them. And that's kind of where I first really got started with figuring out upserts. And so I highly recommend reading there. I highly recommend the Ecto docs. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, or I'll take a few right now. So thank you very much. No, you're good. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's one there.
Hey, thanks very much. Two questions, actually. One is, how do you deal with errors? So I guess if you are inserting a bunch of records at once and one fails, then how do you deal with that? And the other question is, I found that when I'm fighting against Ecto, or this actually comes back from active record days, is that when you're fighting against the framework and doing something different, it might be better to do it the regular way. So I had a similar case like this where I ended up using the standard ID just as an integer, auto-incrementing integer, and having that string field as like a secondary field. Did you think about that at all?
Yeah, and that's definitely something worth considering. So for this case, I was more hoping to just kind of show how you could do that if you wanted to. I do think that it can be very useful to just make that a secondary field at times because, yeah, it is not super fun to have to figure out some of those bugs sometimes. In terms of handling errors, typically what I like to do is make sure that all of my data is validated beforehand, and that tends to narrow down the number of errors that we have. And I didn't get into this much, but we also like to use a lot of transactions. So Ecto Multi makes it really easy to do that. And so we can kind of watch for those and figure those out when they come. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question or if there's a different class of error you were talking about. Okay.
Any more questions? Am I missing anyone? All right. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thanks, everyone.